Thanks again for joining us for the PSAC Prairie Region webinar on political action. Employers may try to discourage employees from participating in political action, but it is your democratic right. With a federal election looming and provincial elections to follow, we're going to discuss how to exercise your political rights while protecting your jobs. So tonight we'll discuss what it means to be political and how you don't have to necessarily be partisan to be political, unions' involvement in political activity, the political rights of PSAC members, whether employed by Treasury Board or another employer, how to get involved in the upcoming elections, and then we'll take questions from those on the webinar tonight. So our first guest speaker is Kent Peterson. He's the strategic advisor for the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. Kent is a student movement and labor movement activist based in Regina, Saskatchewan. He served as president of the University of Regina Students' Union, as a representative on the national executive of the Canadian Federation of Students, as well as on the boards of other student-run and student-funded organizations. He has a Bachelor of Business Administration and a Master's of Public Policy, and he's currently strategic advisor for the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour, as I said, and coordinates their community organizing initiatives. Thanks, Kent.
Okay, well, I'll just get started. And first of all, thank you to PSAC for having me. I think this webinar series is a great idea, and I'm happy people are utilizing it. My presentation will be a lot of me talking, and I'm afraid the only visuals are a video of my face and a picture of my face, and so I apologize for that because they're not the most pleasing visuals to have. But I'll be talking for like about 10 minutes. And then I'll be quiet, I swear. So as Jeffrey mentioned, my name is Kent. I work for the Federation of Labour in Saskatchewan as its strategic advisor. And as was mentioned, I sort of oversee our community organizing initiatives. And we are actually the first Federation of Labour in Canada to adopt a community organizing model like the one we have. And it's called Project Community. And just last week, it was called the organizing model most likely to stop Harper in an article done by the Tyee, which is a Canadian online alternative news site. And I'll round up this paid advertisement by saying you can learn more at www.projectcommunity.ca. So what I should say before I really start is that I'm not a PSAC member, and I have no idea what PSAC members have been told by their employer in terms of what they can and cannot do. I have absolutely no idea what's allowed and what's not allowed, and thank goodness you have people coming up like Edith as a resource, as she clearly does know what she's talking about. And so don't take what I say as what you can do, because I don't know. So now that I've told you everything I don't know, here's some stuff I do know, or at least stuff that I tell people I know. Political and partisan aren't the same thing, and you'll hear me say that about 1,000 times. Political and partisan actually mean radically different things, and the words cannot be used interchangeably. Unions are political. The very act of signing a union card is a political act, and when we become a member of a union, we signal that we believe in workplace democracy. We signal that we think people deserve fair wages, a good pension, the right to work in a safe environment, hell, even sick days, all of which are radically political ideas. So unions are political, but unions are not necessarily partisan. And partisan means prejudiced in favor of a particular cause. And for our purposes, and in the way we use the word partisan, what it really means is someone or an organization that's prejudiced in favor of a political party. There are actually a very, very small number of partisan unions, and they're almost exclusively in the private sector. So UFCW and the United Steelworkers, by their constitution, are partisan unions. They support the New Democratic Party. They donate to the NDP, and they work to elect NDP politicians. Why? Because members of those unions voted to make it so. And unions are democratic, and so members can decide to do that. However, most unions, the overwhelming majority of unions, are not partisan. They don't support particular political parties. but all unions are political. And political and partisan don't mean the same thing. To define what political means, so we sort of went over what partisan means. To define what political means, I'm going to take you on a brief tour through history, and we'll start where else but in ancient Greece. Politics, the word politics, comes from a Greek word politikos that Aristotle used quite often, and all it means is of, for, or relating to citizens. So of citizens, for citizens, relating to citizens. And for our purposes, politics is simply the practice of influencing people. It is the study of the distribution of power and resources within a community, and it is the interrelationships between communities of people. Politics is also the exercising of power and protecting and advancing particular ideas or goals. Now, I swear that's the last time I will sound like a professor during this webinar, but I wanted to set that as our framework, because in the definition of politics that I just gave, how many times did I mention the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, or God forbid, the Conservative Party? None. 0 times, because political and partisan don't mean the same thing. And just a minute ago, I said all unions are political, and I can say that without contradiction, because no matter what unions or any organizations do, they're exercising a political choice. If a union and its members say, we should have sick days at work because, guess what, sometimes people get sick, then they are taking a political stance. By saying that the health and productivity of a worker and a workplace are more important than a few pennies of cheap profit or efficiencies, whatever that means, by saying that, the union and workers are making a political statement. It's not a partisan statement, it's a political one. And so this leads me to the question, how can PSAC members be active in the upcoming federal election without feeling the wrath of their supreme overlords, or whatever your bosses are called? The answer is, don't get partisan, get political. Here at the SFL, and in Saskatchewan at least, we're using Project Community to create those opportunities for people to become engaged in the political process and get to work on issues they care about. We're providing educational opportunities and courses on community organizing. We're keeping in touch with people both through regular online and offline interaction, and we're setting up community teams. These community teams go out into their, you guessed it, communities, whether there's an election or not, and that's an important factor that I'll get back to, and they build support for ideas that will make a difference in people's lives. For instance, we might say, do you think it's fair that a government, any government, and it doesn't matter what the political party is, do you think it's fair that any government can get 39% of the vote, 37% of the seats, in an election where only 61% of people voted, yet get 100% of the power? No. That's not fair. In fact, that's like the dictionary definition of unfair. So what we do with Project Community is we build coalitions of people and organizations, such as Fair Vote Canada, who want to organize around electoral reform. It's not partisan, but it is political, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's just one example. Another example might be, do you think that Canada should have a national universal childcare plan so that families can actually afford to have children? If so, join our efforts to gather petition signatures and pressure politicians to make this a priority. That's a political statement. It's not a partisan one. And actually, I should say this: even if in that discussion you said, and this is just an example, the New Democratic Party has the best childcare plan, that's still not partisan. Why? Because it's the idea you support, not the political party. If the NDP or any other party changed their plan, you might not support it. And so you can still say that certain parties have better policies because it's a political statement if you're supporting the idea and not a partisan one. Okay, so here are some activities that I encourage PSAC members to do before, during, and after the upcoming federal election. So that's before the election, during, and after, because I think they're important to do no matter when there's an election. And again, keep in mind, I have no idea what's on your do's and don'ts list. So one, you could pick an issue you care about and join a community campaign or organization that does work around that issue. For example, the Environmental Society of Alberta or Saskatchewan to do climate change work. Two, you can donate to groups who are doing the on-the-ground work that, for whatever reason, you are unable to do. For example, you could donate to the Council of Canadians for their nationwide campaign about getting young people to vote. Three, you can go door to door and sign up people who support particular policies. For example, will you sign my petition to stop the privatization of valuable public services? Number four, or whatever number we're on, you can help do back-end organizing for campaigns you care about, stuff that's not in the spotlight. For example, you can volunteer to set up chairs for an event, or you can proofread a news release for an organization that's hosting a public forum on homelessness. There's any number of back-end organizing tasks that people can be part of. Number five, whatever, partake in online activism. So for example, you can like the project community Facebook page so that you can stay up to date about all the cool things the SFL is doing on the ground. Or if you're anything like me, you can tweet jokes about Mike Duffy. And there's I see my Twitter handle on the slide there. And finally, and of course, you can support your union's efforts to achieve fairness for all PSAC members. And PSAC will have any number of roles its members can play in that process. Now that's just a taste of some of the things that you can do that aren't partisan at all. None of those mentioned supporting blindly a political party. And I'll end with this final note. The adversaries of most of the things we care about are conservatives, and that's a small c conservative, so right-wingers, and corporations. They will tell you again and again and again that unions and workers shouldn't be political. They will say that being political is the same thing as being partisan, and that's something you can't do. And so they will say that workers should just more or less stay out of the conversation. The reason they say that, of course, is because they are scared of the power that workers hold and the things that we can achieve when we work together. So remember, there's no such thing as being apolitical. There's no such thing as being apolitical, because even choosing to do nothing is a political choice. By choosing to do nothing, you are in fact actively supporting the status quo, and the status quo is unacceptable. So that's my very brief presentation. I did write a short article about this exact topic in the SFL's quarterly newsletter. You can find that at our website, sfl.sk.ca. It provides some historical examples of unions being political and the victories that we've been able to achieve because of it. So, Jeffrey, I will leave that there, and you can pass things over to Edith.
Great, thanks so much, Kent. And I'll also include, I'll post the links to the article that Kent referenced and Project Community in the chat function in this webinar, and I'll also have them listed on the website as well when we post this next week, so you can look for that as well. So next we'll hear from Edith Bramwell, the Coordinator of Representation of the Collective Bargaining Branch of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Edith has practiced and researched in the field of labor law since 1993, following her clerkship at the Federal Court of Appeal. In her previous PSAC roles as a GNA officer and then CBB legal counsel, her work focused on advocacy before arbitrators and adjudicators in the federal court. In her private life, she has served on the boards of numerous organizations which promote social justice and equity. Edith has also served as a legal member of the Criminal Code Review Board and has represented union members in most Canadian labor jurisdictions. So welcome, Edith, and I'll let you take it from here.
So I'd like to pick up on some of the themes that Kent introduced. And, like Kent, I think it's very important for people to think about the difference between sort of broader political activity, what Kent was calling small p political activity, and partisan activity. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that partisan activity, what it looks like when a Public Service Alliance of Canada member wants to support a political party, maybe even wants to work on a campaign, wants to work as a political candidate, perhaps run for election themselves, wants to attend a political convention or do something of that nature. So Public Service Alliance of Canada members work in all sorts of workplaces right across the country. I'm going to talk generally about some of the rules that apply to any union member, and then I'm going to talk very specifically about rules that apply to public service workers. So I agree with Kent that activism is key if we want to bring about some of the changes to make society a better place that we want, some of the desired changes that are at the heart of the struggle for social justice that the union movement is all about. And just like Kent said, there are a variety of ways to go about that. You can focus on an issue, and your right to political expression is going to be protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Or you can choose to channel your energy and your activism into work for a political party. So the golden rule, in terms of making sure you're striking the right balance between what's allowable in the workplace and your right to political expression, the golden rule to remember is that you never want to make it that the support you're giving to the political party is in fact your employer's support. So what does that mean? That means that it's fine for you to support whatever political party you care to support, but your employer shouldn't be made to appear that they're also supporting the party because you do. So that means that when we are in a campaign office, if we are canvassing, if we are wearing a political button, we are not at the same time wearing a uniform if we wear a uniform on the job. That means that if we're interviewed, let's say at a rally, we're not identifying ourselves as public service workers or as employees of any particular employee. You can identify yourself as a union member. That is absolutely fine, but you cannot identify yourself as a public service worker because it makes it appear that the public service organization where you work has somehow delegated you to that rally or that event. And it works in the other direction as well. When you go into the workplace, you cannot canvass or campaign or work for a political party in your workplace while you're doing your job. You shouldn't be making calls. You know, if you're part of a political campaign or if you're making calls for a political party, you obviously cannot do that on employer's time. You can't canvass your colleagues on the employer's time. That's not possible. So that's the golden rule for what Kent would describe as partisan political activity for all workers, for all unionized workers. Your employer doesn't travel along with you in the shape of a uniform that you wear or a vehicle that you drive or government ID that you wear or even just identifying yourself as an employee of a particular employee when you're engaged in your political activities. And your political activities are something that you cannot do while you're at work. And as long as we observe those rules, we should not have any difficulty from any employer for expressing our political opinions on our own time. If an employer does choose to discipline you because it's learned of some political activity that you've been involved in, the right to grieve. And the PSAC will support you in your right to political expression. Now, there are special rules for public service workers, and I'd like to highlight those because they really are a bit different and unique. The Public Service Employment Act establishes public service workers' right. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just having computer issues. Sorry. Establishes public service workers' rights to freedom of political expression. That right is a relatively new one. It used to be, before 1991, that public service workers had no rights to political expression whatsoever. They were prohibited from engaging in any political activities. The Charter became part of Canadian law in 1982, and in 1991, the Supreme Court heard a challenge. The name of the case was Osborne, that had wound its way through the courts. And it was determined that the previous laws that had prohibited public service workers from participating in political activity were unconstitutional and violated the rights of freedom of political expression. So what we now have is a section of the Public Service Employment Act which has as its purpose to recognize the right of employees, this is public service employees, to engage in political activities while maintaining the principle of political impartiality in the public service. What that means in a nutshell is that if you're a public service worker, you have to maintain the appearance of impartiality if that is necessary in the performance of your duties. And it is not, in fact, necessary for the vast majority of public service workers to be impartial because they're not engaged in policy-making functions. However, public service workers do need to be somewhat extra mindful of the rules in this regard. The Public Service Employment Act defines political activity a little bit differently from the way that Kent defined it. The Public Service Employment Act, which applies to all federal public service workers, defines political activity as any activity in support of, within, or in opposition to a political party or candidate, or as the act of seeking nomination or being a candidate in an election. And the minute that you engage as a public service worker in political activity which fits that definition, the Public Service Commission may inquire into whether or not your activity interferes with your impartiality, and anyone, including a member of the public, actually has the right to ask the Commission to investigate whether your impartiality is in question. So that all sounds a little bit daunting, and it's a piece of federal legislation, so that always is something that sounds very formal, but the reality is, for most public service workers, impartiality is not a requirement for them to fulfill the duties of their job. So if you are in a policy-sensitive area, this is something that you may want to consider. You may want to discuss more carefully with somebody at the union office, but unless you're working in a sensitive policy area, your political rights, following that golden rule that you are exercising your political rights off the job and off of the employer's time, Your right to freedom of expression political expression is protected by the Charter, and you have the right to have the same participation in the democratic process that any other citizen of Canada would have. I do want to just mention one caution before we hand it back to Kent. If you are a public service worker, you need to be mindful that if you are supporting a political party on Facebook, on Twitter, or on any other form of social media, that is also considered political activity if you're supporting a party or a candidate. And you want to keep anything that shows you as a public service worker completely separate from your support of political activity. What does that mean? That means that if, for example, you're carrying a sign that supports a particular candidate, you are not at the same time in a photograph, let's say, driving a government vehicle, wearing your government ID, wearing a uniform if that's part of your daily job. I would be careful about anything that shows you in your workplace, obviously, with a button or a sign in your workplace supporting a particular candidate that then goes on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or something of that nature. The golden rule also translates into what we put on social media. So you don't want to say, this CRA employee supports Joe Smith, candidate for election, as part of your what you're presenting on social media. The problem with the statement I just described is that you're identifying yourself as a public service worker, and you're linking that identity as a public service worker to your support of the candidate, and indirectly implying that it is your employer who supports the candidate, and that violates that golden rule I just mentioned, and is a use of social media that you would want to avoid.
So right now I'll introduce you to Marianne Ledoux. She's the Regional Executive Vice President for the PSAC Prairie Region. She's also the winner of the 2011 Prairie Voice Award for Political Action. So she is well suited to talk to you on this topic, and she'll be discussing how you can get involved and sort of some ideas on what PSAC members can do.
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, you snuck in the Prairie Voice Award thing there. You didn't tell me that. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar and thank Edith and Kent, before I forget, for coming on for the call. The distinction between political and partisan is something that employers right now are out there in the federal sector basically telling our members that they cannot do certain things. And one thing that I feel extremely passionately about is that it is my right as a citizen of Canada to be politically active. And while I understand the distinction of bringing my personal politics into the workplace, I'll be damned if any employer is going to tell me what I'm going to do on my own time. So as long as we're careful about how we do that, whether it's putting a sign on your lawn, whether it's door knocking for a candidate, dropping flyers, making phone calls, any of that, if you do it on your own time and you are, as Edith said, not identifying yourself as a public service worker, I think that's something that each of us can contribute to basically change this government. We are completely nonpartisan as a union in the terms that Kent outlined. We are absolutely political. We are not affiliated to any party. And the one thing that we know is, for a significant number of our members, the political world is overlapping with our collective bargaining right now. And it really is, we're at a point where this government, our current Conservative government, has clearly indicated that they do not support unions. They do not want to see any gains for workers in this country, and they're looking for concessions. So we know that it's best not just for our members but for our communities to change government. So how can we do that? Without telling anyone how to vote, who to vote for, it's really simple. It's about educating our members and letting people know, here's the issues, here's the record of the current government. So, if you look on for PSAC members in the latest issue of the Union Voice that you should have gotten in the last month or so, there it is on the screen. On the very back page is a great poster that you can cut out and put on your union bulletin board. It's about getting the facts, finding out what the government's issue is on things. Someone might say they have voted conservative in the past or they support all of that, but when you ask them if they support how this government has treated veterans or the unemployed or others marginalized in our communities, they won't support that. So it's about getting the facts and connecting the dots. Find out about your local candidates. People are going to be knocking on your door. When they come to your door, be prepared to ask them a question. What do you know about public services? Would you restore these public services? Do you think these services are important? Do you think the work that I do for Canadians every day is important? And judge your vote on their responses. And spread the word. We need to talk to people, not just in the workplace. We need to talk to our family. We need to talk to our friends. One thing that has become clear to me lately is that when people talk about public services, they think we're all a bunch of faceless suits, that are, hiding in a corner, collecting these big dollars and big pensions. And when you say, but wait a minute, that, when the government is saying, talking about public service workers, that's me. I'm your kid's hockey coach. I volunteer in the community. We need to have these discussions within the community, be proud of the work that we do and tell people what we do because they don't know. So share information, utilize social media, utilize your networks with the caution of making sure you're not identifying your employer. We have a variety of places where you can join up for information. The PSAC national website, there'll be more information coming shortly on the federal election. Twitter, Facebook, all of these are available. The Prairies, PSAC, prairies.psac.com, where you registered for the webinar. There's a lot of information on there. Share those links out. They're available to anyone. And at the end of the day, we honestly believe, even though we never will tell anyone who to vote for, the critical thing is we have to vote. I think too many of our members don't exercise the right to vote. And, we're in a country where we have access to that democratic process. And, governments have been elected with very slim majorities, as Kent had mentioned. So we need to make sure that people have the information, they're able to make a decision, and at the end of the day, that they actually go to the voting station and vote. So there's all kinds of opportunities. I will throw a pitch in as well for our area councils. So we have area councils throughout the prairies, and that's kind of the political action wing. So they're going to be organizing actions leading up to the federal election in your community. Is there an event in your community where we could have a discussion with the public about public services leading up to the election? Is there candidates forums? Are we going to do a mail out? The area councils is a place where any member has access to, and if you only have a little bit of time to give, you have a little bit of interest, you'd like to do something but you don't know what to do, please go to the Prairies website and you can check out your regional office, and all the notices for area councils are there and they can get you put on the list. So this time around, it's absolutely critical that our members engage in the process and that we make informed decisions, and hopefully on October 19th, we'll see a different vision within Canada. So thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Marianne. So just another reminder now, we're going to go to questions. So if you have questions for Marianne, for Kent, for Edith, or just general questions that any of them can answer, feel free to click the blue button with the yellow hand and the green arrow. and that'll put you in line to ask a question, and I'll unmute your mic when we're ready to take your question. If you're feeling shy, you can also type me one of the questions in the panel on the right, and I will read that out loud. So right now, it looks like we have a question from Gus. So Gus, I will unmute you and go ahead now with your question.
Thank you, the three speakers. This is a great, valuable information. My question kind of popped to my head when Edith was talking about, public servants. If we are demonstrating or in a rally or something, not identifying myself. My question is, okay, let's say we are on a Sunday in a rally, and some reporter is pestering you about, okay, so you're against Harper, so the rally is about, stop Harper. Where do you work? What type of work you do during, weekdays and stuff. So like we can't say we work for the Treasury Board. We can't say like the place where we work at. Am I right? That's what I understand from Edith.
You answering honestly. It's about the way you choose to identify yourself. So, yeah, I mean, if somebody, I don't think it's all that likely that a reporter is going to ask you where you work. It would be perfectly your right to just describe what you do rather than saying who you work for. Say, I'm a caseworker or something that's vague. But the main thing is not so much what happens when you're asked a question, it's which is not something that you choose, but the choice you make to identify yourself right away. So what you don't say, somebody says, hi, how are you? What's your name? You don't say, I'm Joe Smith. I work for correctional services, or I'm Joe Smith. I work as an auditor for CRA, or whatever. You do not identify yourself by reference to your public service employment. And often when people do end up, when we've seen people identifying themselves in terms of their public service employment, it's actually something that they weren't quite aware of. They're wearing a federal government ID, or perhaps they're wearing a uniform. Those were two examples that I gave. So that's what you want to make sure, take the time to go home first and change your uniform, drop your government ID in your glove compartment. That's what you want to do. The risk, which is really not that hard to avoid the minute that you're aware of it, is giving any appearance that the issue you're supporting or what you're saying about the issue you're speaking to is something that you somehow want to give the appearance that your employer supports, because that's just not true. I mean, as Marianne was saying, public service workers have the same rights to political expression as any other citizen in Canada. What they can't do, though, and I think if we think about this for a few minutes, it just makes sense. They can't give the appearance that their employer shares their views, because, the employer probably doesn't. So that's what we're looking to avoid. Does that help clarify your question?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay.
All right, thanks again, guys.
Thank you, Edith.
You're welcome.
Now we will go to a question from Terry Lynn. So Terry Lynn, you're unmuted. What's your question tonight?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm really enjoying the webinar, and it's made me think about some of the things that I might have on my social media pages. I guess my question is, I live in Alberta, so I mean, we're public servants, we're federal, and so a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is federally based. And is it fair of me to assume that we should maybe follow those same practices as federal public servants if we participate within the provincial elections as well? Or is there some differences or guidelines maybe shaded. I'm not sure. I don't know if that makes sense or...
That makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So it's Edith. I'd be happy to address that unless somebody else wants to. So I mentioned the Public Service Employment Act, which applies to all federal public service workers. And that act has some definitions of political activity. And political activity is activity in support of or in opposition to a political party or candidate at any level: provincial, federal, territorial, municipal. So the minute that you engage in any of those activities, that's political activity. Now, just as Marianne said, we have the same democratic rights as any other citizen when we are public service workers. But there is that issue of public service impartiality, which has to be balanced against it. So you don't want to give the impression that you're using your public service position or you're co-opting your public service employer into the appearance of supporting what are really your views. And if you happen to work in a policy-sensitive area, there may be other restrictions that apply to you, and you've got to be a little bit more careful.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. That clarifies it greatly.
Jeffrey, can I add something, please? There we go. So just going back to Gus's question for a second, you know, reporters have a job to do. So if you're at a rally and stuff, they are going to try to get people to talk. You can say no. It's perfectly fine. So if they push you on it, just say, you know, I can't disclose that publicly. So, you know, if you're ever in doubt about giving information, that's probably your gut telling you that it's information that is in your best interest not to put out publicly. Because here's what's happened in other situations where someone has identified as a department and the reporter doing what reporters are supposed to do, the journalist, will dig a little deeper. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? One thing you have to recognize is that if you are ever a media spokesperson for your union, never give out information that's not available to the public. If you have internal information, be very generic, and that's if you are identified as a media spokesperson on behalf of the union, which gives you a little bit extra level of protection on some of those issues. But you know, journalists will do what they're trained to do, so they will push, and it's fine to say no. Thanks.
All right, so we'll go to another question here, and just a reminder to click that button to raise your hand or type me a question if you want to ask one. I have a question here over chat from Nancy and Kent. I think this might be geared to you and anyone else who wants to answer after that, but I'll throw it to Kent first. So the question is, we talk a lot about getting involved in the community and in political campaigns, but how can we get more members involved without standing for one political party?
Well, thank you, Nancy, wherever you are, for that question. It's a good question, and one we grapple with a lot in our unions, I'd say. And how can you get more members involved in political stuff without supporting a party? So I mentioned a few examples, but I think, and I'm just going to use one example or one type of member to answer the question. So a lot of the times, as folks who are doing work in our workplaces and involved with our unions, one group of people we're constantly trying to engage are young workers. And now this will be, you know, the severity of this will be different depending on where you work, but a lot of the time we don't have enough young workers, for example, getting engaged in various things. And one of the ways I think to sort of overcome that barrier is to understand where those workers are coming from, the special challenges young workers face, because that's the example I'm using, and what you can do to help facilitate their involvement in political matters, whether that be through the union or through their communities. And so we've made that a priority here at the SFL and in Saskatchewan at least. And I know PSAC and Marianne do a lot of work engaging young workers as well. And so there's a number of things that we can do, like sending them to our educational things we can do. I think this webinar is a fantastic idea to at least start that conversation for young folks. And in Saskatchewan, we're on May 2nd holding our second annual Youth Action Summit, where we bring together young workers, young community members, and we actually train them on how to be effective organizers so that they can then go and pick issues that are important to them and have the tools they need to organize around them. So we're not telling them, hey, you should care about pensions, even though you should, or you should care about this issue or that issue. We're saying, here are some fundamental skills and tools to do what you want. And so I think we can apply that approach to others. As Marianne was saying, it's not about telling people who to vote for. It is about, though, empowering folks to take action on issues they care about. And so we could have a whole series of webinars on that question alone. But I think just consistency and not talking down to people and recognizing where various groups of people come from will help facilitate their involvement. Young workers have different challenges than, say, new Canadians would, or folks who or nearing retirement have different issues, and it's important to respect those differences and work on them. So I hope that off-the-cuff answer at least helped in terms of answering the question.
That's great, thanks, Kent. Marianne, did you have anything you wanted to add to that one?
A lot of what we're doing is about getting the issues out. Sorry, there's a camera. Technology is great sometimes. It's about having that conversation. What does your community look like? We are so stuck on people. Sometimes get so stuck in partisan politics, but the reality is the person that you're electing in your riding, it doesn't matter what party they come from, they're elected to represent you. And it's a bit of accountability on, for us as citizens, that when we cast our ballot, we're casting our ballot for someone, for the person and not the party. And we have every right to make them accountable to us, and it really doesn't matter what party they're from. They have a responsibility. They have the right to be able to have an opinion different than their party. They have a responsibility to get to know who they have for constituents in their riding. So we sometimes focus too much on the partisan, but there's a lot of things that we can do that don't have to be partisan.
Okay, so on to the next question submitted by chat here from Gina. So Gina asks, and Edith, I think this one will be for you. If you show the government as an employer on your Facebook or Twitter page, should you change that? Can that be used against you by employers?
So I think the answer to that question really depends on what else you're doing on your Facebook. If you're showing the government as an employer, you do not want to be posting anything on your Facebook which is in support of or in opposition to a political party at the provincial, federal, or municipal level. So if you're doing any of those things, and many of us are, many of us will copy a political cartoon or an article or a commentary which might be critical of a party or of the government of the day, and that becomes potentially activity in support of or in opposition to a political party. So if you're doing that, your tag as a federal public service worker should probably come off. I mean, if your Facebook page is all about kittens and rainbows, you're welcome to identify as a public service worker. It's not going to cause you any problems.
Okay, and now we will go to a question from Suzanne. She asks if she can work on election day, either as a polling clerk or other duties as long as I'm not identified to a specific candidate, um, and if of course if it's on a day off, it says.
Of course, you're not on working time. If you're working E-Day, you might be doing that on behalf of an organization that's not a political party, but the odds are you're doing it for a political party. So if you're working E-Day for a political party, you probably certainly you don't want to at any point identify yourself as a public service worker. I think you all must be sick of me saying that by now, but here I am saying it again. And I mean, you're probably doing that somewhat in the background. Particularly if you're working, typically on E-Day, parties are going to pull votes. So if you're working for one particular party, you're going to be at your most protected if you're doing that in a way that doesn't identify you. And there are many, many jobs working E-Day of that nature. But that, I know I keep harping on this and I keep coming back to it, but if it's a takeaway that everybody gets from this evening, don't identify yourself as a public service worker in any way, whatever the activity that you're engaging in is.
And Edith, as a follow-up to that question, if an employer were to if an employer were to deny you vacation leave to work on election day, is that something that you can grieve?
Well, most of our collective agreements have, you don't have to tell the employer the purpose for which you're taking vacation, and I would not. I would not be saying I'm taking vacation leave because I want to work on an election. You would say that you want to take vacation leave, and most of our collective agreements have some sort of operational requirements element to them in terms of the employer's obligation to grant you the leave that you've requested. If your leave is denied because the employer says there are operational requirements which are keeping you in the workplace and you think that's bogus, whatever the reason for your leave was, whether it was simply to go fishing or whether it was to do some more civic duty, you would have the option of grieving that. But I wouldn't be announcing to your employer, nor is there any need to, that you are planning to go engage in election day activities. That's none of your employer's business.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so we're going to wrap up shortly. I just have one more question that I want to get to. And Kent, this is targeted towards you and what you talked about earlier. And it's a question submitted on chat from Brent. So Brent says, some members sometimes say that unions shouldn't be involved in political action and should only be involved in workplace issues. How do you convince those workers that unions should be involved?
Well, thank you, Brent, for the question. So some members say that unions shouldn't be involved in political activity. Some members are wrong. And how do you convince them? Yeah, I'm getting feedback, but I don't know if it's mine. What I would say is, first of all, you will never convince 100% of people to do anything. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would remind coworkers who might say that focusing on workplace issues are political issues. When we talk about wanting to have fair pensions, what they're really talking about is retirement security, and they're making a political statement that people shouldn't be chained to their jobs until they drop dead, and they should in fact have an opportunity after serving in a career to enjoy the golden years of their life. And so that's a political statement. If someone says you should only focus on workplace issues like filing grievances, well, guess what? Those too are political, because behind those are sentiments of the boss shouldn't have complete control over workers' lives, and that the boss should uphold their end of an agreement. And so I would say that those things are political. Now, I think what Brent is talking about is, say, PSAC or any other union talks about the need for a national universal child care plan. And some workers might say, that's not a workplace issue, you shouldn't be focusing on that. Well, tell that to any woman who has a child who has to make the choice between giving up her career to raise a child because she can't afford to put the child into childcare, and tell those people and those mothers that childcare isn't a direct workplace issue, and it certainly has many other direct impacts on work. And so I would say that all issues behind them are political, whether we consider them direct workplace or not. The final thing, and then I'll stop talking, the final thing I would say to these people is, whatever your union does, it only does with the blessing of its membership. Unions operate on direct democracy, and so if a majority of members vote to support campaigns like childcare or climate change or whatever, then guess what? That's what the union's going to do. If those coworkers who say we shouldn't be doing that have enough supporters where they can go to a meeting and change the priorities of a union, then they can do that. It's called democracy. And so the final thing I would say is the union's priorities are the priorities of its members, and they reflect that.
Perfect. Thanks, Kent, and thanks, Edith. So, Marianne, I'll throw it back to you now for final thoughts on tonight's webinar on political action and to close it down.
Great. Thank you. Oops, got twisted around there. So we're getting close to the hour. I want to thank Edith again for the information. We get a lot of questions about what we can do on our own personal time, in our personal lives, and one thing that I want to raise for everyone is that right about this time, because we do have a provincial election called as of this morning, yesterday, in Alberta, we will have provincial elections coming up in Saskatchewan and Manitoba early next year, and the federal election. So as soon as we get into close to election periods, employers start sending out information to employees saying, you know, you should not do this. You need to read between the lines, and you need to not accept what they're sending out. They will send an email saying, you know, you should not be partisan, you should not wear a button, you should not work on a campaign. Should and could and would are all completely different. If you think that your employer is infringing on your political rights, you need to talk to your local. You need to talk to your component, to your regional vice president, or call the nearest regional office, because at the end of the day, no employer can take that away from you, and they will try as much as they can. They'll try intimidate, they'll try bully, and they will use language that is meant to scare and intimidate our members. So if you think that's happening, please let us know. And on the screen is the information where you can connect with us. So you can connect up with the Facebook page at PSAC Prairies, our Twitter, and our YouTube. We'll be putting more information out. We'll have information on specific issues that you can share with coworkers to start that discussion, to share with your family. And you know, we encourage everyone to find that one thing that you can do leading up to this next election, be it provincial or federal, that will actually help put governments in place that believe in strong public services and that really seek to leave our communities in a better place than when they found them. So thank you for taking the time. And next month's webinar is going to be Turn Back Time. We'll be talking about labor history, which is something that we often forget about and we don't spend the time on. So we'll be talking labor history. And in June, we'll be talking about health and safety and the changes to Bill C-4. We don't have the webinar subjects beyond June. We'll start them up again in September. If you have suggestions, please let us know. And also, you know, on the 19th of every month leading up to the election in October, we're asking locals to do something, to do an action that works in your workplace to show that you support your bargaining teams, that, you know, as a union, we're prepared for the federal election. If, you know, there's all kinds of ideas on the website. You can look at pictures, make sure and take pictures, send them into the regional office, show support for your bargaining team, show support for, you know, strong progressive communities, and that you support your union. And other than that, I'd like to thank you. Everyone who participates will get a survey by email, and we do read them all. So if you have questions, if you have suggestions, please fill out the survey and let us know. And thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you next month.